Imagine you're some kind of a popular application and your servers are under constant pressure. So one of your servers crashes. And this is caused by an incoming request from the client. And this is totally fine because servers crash all the time because let's say we forgot to handle this error gracefully. And then you look into the logs to see what happened. And then you see that the server tries to recover. So it tries to restart within a couple of seconds. But then before it's able to serve the users again, it crashes one more time. And this goes on and on and on because as it's trying to restart or recover from the crash, we are still bombarded by the requests from the outside because, as I said, our app is very popular and in demand. Now, this is something called a Retry Storm anti-pattern, and you can actually notice this anti-pattern from the logs that you will see because this is going to follow a similar pattern where you crash, recover, and then crash one more time. So now let's talk about how to avoid this actually, because if you don't know how to act on it, you might run into this issue very often. So one of the first things that you can do is make sure that your client follows the retry pattern and proper capping. Now, who is the client in this case? Well, if you're a company and some kind of an application where your client can be a browser, right? Or a mobile application that you build and your server lives somewhere else. So you need to make sure that your client here that makes the request on the behalf of the user, let's say this is the website that contacts the server, has proper retry mechanisms. So I already made a full video on retry patterns that you can follow, but one of the suggestions here would be to simply use an exponential backoff, meaning this request here failed, okay? So the question is, when do we retry again? Well, we can retry in 1 second. If this one fails again, then we're going to try in 3 seconds. If this one fails again, then we're going to try in 9 or 10 seconds. And as you see, this interval becomes bigger and bigger. And at some point we say, well, we tried like 3 times within 10 seconds. So we're going to stop making requests so that we don't cause an retry storm on our server. So we're going to simply return an error to the user, all right? And there's another very popular pattern called circuit breaker. I again made a full video on it, dive deep into it, so you can check it out if you're interested. But a circuit breaker is something that is very similar to electrical engineering, where let's say you have a circuit breaker and this request is incoming here. And as long as your circuit breaker is open, your requests are never going to reach the server. Now, why do we do that? Because of the retry storms. So we're only going to let this request 1 out of, let's say, 10 times, and this request is going to go through. But then if it fails again, we're going to open this circuit breaker again, and for some time our requests are no longer reachable again. And again, we let 1 of the 10 requests go through the next time, and if it works out, then we close this circuit breaker and our server is able to accept the request again. And this is how a retry storm can be really avoided. But the next thing that you can also incorporate into your solution is something called a retry after header. So if you use some kind of a gateway, depending on the cloud provider that you use, or let's say you're simply using a reverse proxy such as Nginx, you can simply return a retry after header, which can be returned on 503, 420, and so on. And this is going to signal the client that, hey, you need to retry after some kind of a delay, let's say 10 seconds, and you need to be aware whether this header is coming or not. All right. Then the next point is exactly the same what we mentioned before. After capping, so you need to decide what kind of an error you're going to return to the user. Maybe it actually makes sense to tell the user, hey, please, we're experiencing some kind of problems. Can you please refresh after 10 seconds or 20 seconds again? I'm pretty sure you've already seen this kind of errors, and this totally makes sense if our server is under pressure and we haven't dealt with this yet. All right, the next point is batching. Maybe you're using some kind of an SDK. Let's say you're using AWS as your cloud provider. AWS has some kind of an SDK that you can use right away as from your client. And this SDK is going to be a middleman between your client and the service that you are spinning up on your AWS. And usually these SDKs are very powerful. Maybe one of them has batching, meaning if the client makes like 10 requests to your SDK at the same time for whatever reason, this SDK is going to batch them and make only 1 request to the server, and then some kind of a gateway, like our next point, is going to handle this. So just make sure you have, whether you have batching available in your arsenal or not. But the next point would be a gateway with a bulkhead pattern and throttling. So usually you would have a gateway sitting in front of your servers, okay? An API gateway that is able to route the request to the proper server. And you can actually enable a bulkhead pattern on your gateway, saying that if one of the servers has crashed or is experiencing issues, you can simply throttle the request, the incoming request. This is basically kind of a circuit breaker, acts like a circuit breaker, but it's done on the gateway layer. Alright, the next point is simply take into account what kind of an error you're returning. If the return server is 500, okay, maybe we take it as a signal that we can retry. But if the error says not authorized, meaning you gave simply the wrong password or your token has expired, what's the point in retrying? There's no point to retry. You simply are not authenticated. So always take into account what kind of an error you're dealing with. And the last point is the length of the retries. So as we already talked about capping, this 10 seconds that I mentioned here, that, hey, we failed 3 times within 10 seconds, is kind of arbitrarily defined. I just came up with it, but depending on your business use case, you need to come up with this second. For example, if you're a banking application, maybe this retry capping length should be lower. If you're some kind of other website where you can let your users wait a bit, maybe you can define a bigger capping length like 30 seconds. All right. So if you find this video useful, please like this video and subscribe. I really cannot emphasize how much this is going to help my channel. And of course, please check out our sponsors, Eraser.io, which is basically this blackboard that I'm using pretty much in every video that I'm making because it's very flexible and I love using it. Alright guys, I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.